Good evening, everybody. My name is Doug Mitchell. I have the distinct honor of serving as the executive director of the Glacier National Park Conservancy, and welcome to our November book club for 2024, our last book club of the year. We had 6 amazing books this year, but I have to tell you selfishly, I've really been looking forward to this one. We had originally planned to do it live at Book Passage bookstore here in Corte Madera, California. I'm in Marin County this week, and unfortunately, there is an atmospheric river, and Book Passage has no power tonight. So, our author Jerry Emory and I have gone to separate Zoom locations, but as always, we found a way to make it work. Joined again tonight by the amazing team, Amy Lucky and Andrew Smith. Thank you guys for being with us, and it's just a treat to be with each other and be in community and talk about Glacier, talk about really an extraordinary leader in the national park system, lesser known. Although I think here in California, there's a lot more knowledge about George Melendez Wright, and it'll be fun to hear some more tonight from Jerry Emory. So it really, as I said, it's been a pleasure to get to know Jerry and discovering his work. When I called him to see if he'd be open to doing this, turns out, he's here in Marin County. This is where I grew up before I met Julie, and we moved to Montana some 40 plus years ago. And we've been able to get together and get to know each other. So Jerry, thanks a bunch for becoming a friend and for coming and being with us tonight.
You bet. It's been fun.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about this incredibly accomplished person. A graduate of both Stanford and the University of California at Berkeley. He spent his career in conservation, education, and writing. He's the author of 6 books. I don't know if I've read 6 books, but he's written 6 books on conservation and the environment and science. He has published articles in Nat Geo, Travel and Leisure, and many, many more. And was the recipient of the Hubert Herring Award, which is given by the Pacific Coast Council on Latin American Studies to recognize outstanding work on Latin America. Jerry is joining us from the place where you wrote this book, in that room, right, Jerry?
I did. My man cave here, as my daughters call it. Culture based on scientific research to inform management practices, basically. He was in the Park Service at a time when there was a very radical transition from it was all about facade management, as one writer called it. It was all about putting on a show in the big hotels and trying to get in the tourists. And he showed up and wanted to work on wildlife and some other issues, but he felt that you had to have done the field work and the travel in order to inform those management decisions. And so that was new. That was new, absolutely new, and that has carried forward, for decades.
And this is a life ended much too early, and it seems as a casual reader, but someone involved in this work, it seems like it's taken us a long time to get back to the things that George Wright was writing about and pushing in the 1920s and 30s. Do you think his legacy would be different if he had not died so young?
Oh, I definitely do. He had already been discussed as a potential director of the National Park Service. Horace Albright, the second director of the National Park Service, who was the right-hand person to Stephen Mather, who was the first director from 1916 to 1929, and then Albright from 29 to 33. They recognized in Wright his leadership abilities above and beyond his field work and his science-based push to inform management decisions, that he was a great team leader and manager. And in fact, Albright, even though he retired in 29, he was the kind of guy, if you read his biography, he was the kind of guy that just couldn't help but to make suggestions to the Park Service. So he's constantly sending notes to the acting director or the director. And one of those was that when they were going through management, a reorganization in 1935, and he said, "You should just give George Wright the entire Western United States, and give Connie Worth, who was a architect, I believe, a landscape architect, the East Coast. So give Connie Worth the smaller parks in the East, but give everything else to Wright." And just let them, take care of it. That didn't happen. I mean, they did other management things, and plus Wright, passed away in February of 36. But I think that if he had lived, that the science and the wildlife emphasis would have continued even through the war. The war was had a big impact on parks, and visitation was down for obvious reasons. Resources, were shunted to other needs. And then after the war, it was all about restoring old buildings. It was all about infrastructure. There was no real interest in wildlife or science and biology. And so there was a hiatus of almost 30 years until it began to become important again in the 60s, 1960s. And we could talk about that later. But so I think he would have continued on. I think he would have eventually become the director of the Park Service. And he was also seen as a rising star by the Secretary of the Interior, FDR's Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, a self-described, curmudgeon. In fact, I think his biography is called Curmudgeon. I mean, the guy was not liked by a lot of people, but he and Wright got along well. And who knows, maybe Wright would have made it up to, Secretary of the Interior to oversee much more than just parks. Because Wright's view was beginning to expand towards the very end of his life, to also cultural resources and the importance of towns and the impact of things outside of parks in parks. So he began to have a much more expansive view of what needed to be done in the United States. So, I think that would have been a logical trajectory.
It's interesting too, and you point out in the book that he had private means, as did Stephen Mather, that he was able to bring to bear. And correct me if I've taken this too far, but when he brought up the idea of doing this kind of work and traveling, in general, people said, sure, but we don't have any money for it, right? But he did have the ability to support that work. And do you think that played some role in the Park Services letting him have a lot of rope to go out and do these things?
Well, yes and no. He did have financial resources to do that. And in fact, he had been in discussion with Albright and other top managers for a while in 1929 to conduct a wildlife survey. And they did say, we don't have the money for that right now. And this is before the Depression, but they didn't have the money for it. And he needed a couple of staff or colleagues. And so he did offer to pay for it the first 2 years himself. And then as long as the Park Service would pick up the last year. So he, and he wasn't thinking about just like 1 year. He was thinking, a 3-year survey, wildlife survey of the big Western parks. And there was only like 20 parks at the time. And so he did. He put that money paid for the survey, paid for the salaries, paid for equipment for a couple of years. And although that might have impressed a lot of people, the administration at the time, the culture, he was 5'4". He had dark skin. He was half Salvadoran. He was very gregarious and well liked, very social, but still, and he was very young. I mean, he went to Berkeley when he was 16, and so he was super young and maybe a little different looking in an administration of older Caucasian males. And although there was never any prejudice that I heard about or read about, still he had to break through that barrier and convince them with his ideas what was important. So it wasn't always smooth sailing, but being able to put together that trust was very helpful, obviously. And then the Park Service did pick up the tab for the rest of the survey. And also a couple of things that he said he definitely wanted. Didn't sign a contract or anything, but he wanted to be able to print what ended up being Fauna 1 and Fauna 2, which were the results of the survey, because he wanted to be able to share the challenges of the parks vis-a-vis wildlife and other issues with his colleagues and academia.
And I'm glad you mentioned Fauna 1, because I have the practice of kind of going in deep dives. So of course, when I started reading your book, I had to buy Fauna 1 and dig into that as well. And we're giving away a copy tonight of Fauna 1.
Awesome.
And also I'm going to give away a Glacier beanie. So Amy will take care of that here in a bit. And as always, folks, put your questions in the chat, and I'll turn it over to Amy here in a bit, and she'll ask your questions and might even ask you to unmute to do that. But I want to, we were talking a little bit about his Wright's background and being Salvadoran. Family was obviously very important and active in his life, and one of the key, Cordelia Wright, auntie, is really a key figure and influence. Talk to us a little bit more about her impact on both his career and personal trajectory. Do you think, she is one of the reasons that he was so comfortable around a powerful woman and was one of the early advocates for women being a part of the National Park Service?
Well, I do believe that, but let me explain briefly, and I'll try to be brief, who she was. So George Wright lost his mother, who was Salvadoran, Mercedes Melendez, at the age of 2. And then his father when he was about 7. This is in 1906, 1910, right? And they lived in San Francisco on Laguna Street. The house is still there. And Auntie had moved into that house in 1905. And Auntie was called Auntie because George Wright's father called her Auntie, because she had married George Wright's father. Sorry, George Wright's grandfather, because his original wife died. It was her sister. So back in the Victorian era, it was often common for them to marry the sister. So she literally was auntie to George Wright's father. So that name carried forward. So George Wright's grandfather dies and Auntie moves in with the son. So she's there with 3 boys. George Wright had a younger brother and a much older brother. And she and George just became very close from the very beginning. There's really funny letters from the father saying he can't get a word in edgewise to George or Auntie because they're too busy, studying and being together and learning together. And so pretty soon the younger brother was sent to El Salvador to be raised after the father died, and the older brother moved to El Salvador to live there. And literally at the age of 7 and 72, they were a family. That was it. Now, there was a lot of Salvadoran relatives that came through the house and stayed, and I think that's what kept up Wright's Spanish. But they bonded early on, and they stayed together, and she just let him totally explore San Francisco, which is a much different place back then. He was really into birds and going hiking, and she facilitated all that all the way through college. And then when he moved, he first got his first job in Yosemite as a ranger. She moved in 1927. She moved into the Ahwahnee Hotel, which had just been finished, in order to be close to her boy, George. And she died there. She died there a year later. And so, yeah, they were super close. And she was a businesswoman. She had taken over her husband's business affairs. And so she was a pretty strong individual. She came from the Victorian era, but I think had very open attitudes towards certain things from what we can understand. So she was very, very influential. And when she passed, I mean, that was it. Wright had some relationship with some of his cousins. His mother was one of 10. So there's a lot of Melendez out there. And there's also Wrights in El Salvador. There's a lot of John T. Wrights in El Salvador, believe it or not, today. And I've corresponded with him for the book. So that's been quite interesting.
And as you worked on this book, there's so many great stories. Give us a couple of the stories that didn't make it into the book.
Well, I did have to cut a lot of the manuscript, but not necessarily a lot of the great stories. I don't have anything that's humorous or super quirky, but when Wright did start in Yosemite as a ranger, um, it became known. Some bureaucrat somewhere found out that he was only 5'4", and I guess there was a height regulation at the time, mostly because most rangers carried firearms as they do today. I mean, right? There's all these distinctions between different people within the Park Service. I was never able to find out how tall you had to be. I think it was probably 5'6". But of all people, Horace Albright went to bat for Wright and he was just like a dog with a bone. He just would not. He kept on writing the director, the acting director, because Mather had severe depression issues, so he was often out of the office for a long time, and there'd be an acting director. And so the reason why Albright wrote these letters to the acting director saying we got to make an exception and keep George Wright was I found out that at that point, Albright was the superintendent of Yellowstone and also the assistant director of the Park Service. And remember, this is a really different time. During the wintertime, they closed all the northern parks, like Crater Lake, Rainier, all these places. They just shut down because who was going to go visit? The road infrastructure was terrible, Glacier. Um, and so Albright was a California boy, and so he would say he's working out of the San Francisco office, but he was often moving around. Well, it turns out that the superintendent of Yellowstone had a heart attack in 1927, right when Wright started working there. So Albright showed up to take care of the park for about 3 months. So it was a small little town, right? And they spent a lot of time together and they got to know each other. And the only reason why I found out about this was because when I was going really deep and getting really nerdy, like doing the research in the archives, I found the annual report from the superintendent from 1928 for Yellowstone thanking Albright for being there over the winter. And I was like, bingo. That's because how else? Because these notes he wrote about George Wright were really specific and personal. Like he knew everything about him, and I never could quite figure out why.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Albright obviously is, a huge Mather Albright. I mean, really huge figures in at a time when the Park Service was going to make it or not make it. Those were some pretty important days to have some strong leaders. And Albright, I don't know, it'd be interesting in your view, but Albright seemed to be the right man at the right time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was so dedicated, and he had extreme. Um, uh, he thought Mather was just the best person he'd ever met, and he was very defensive of his mental illness, and he was a trained lawyer, and he had been there since the very beginning when they were trying to figure out just how to get people into parks, how to work on infrastructure. Mather was all about the big hotels and trying to get trains and stagecoaches into the parks like Glacier, and and then eventually Albright came along and then had to start dealing with people like Wright who were interested in other things. But he was open to it, and he and Wright became good colleagues. They disagreed a little bit on feeding bears, like a lot. Um, Albright loved the bear feeding programs, and Wright just thought they were the ultimate wrong thing to be doing in a national park. Um, but Albright retired in 33 after helping FDR set up the CCC, and went on to have a very nice career and working for a potash company out of New York. Albright was a millionaire, self-made millionaire on borax.
Right.
So both mineral guys.
Well, and I want to come back to this discussion about the Organic Act in a minute. I'm going to take just a second, particularly since we have Mackenzie Law on us with us in Zoom, and the top book
I'm Mackenzie.
is so Mark. We have 6 books selected for next year. We have the dates with the authors, and it's just so wonderful to have the authors be able to join us in the book club. We're going to put in the chat. We have these books all in stock, all 6 books. You can buy the book bundle. There you go, Contested Land. Very interesting topic. I think more poignant a topic here next year, and that'll be in May. Hoping to do that in person here at Book Passages. But there's a link now in the chat where you can get the book bundle. You get a calendar and a bookmark and free shipping. We also have 2 bonus books that we're going to do for this year, because there's one called Becoming Little Shell, which is a really important book by Chris Latreille, who's Montana's poet laureate. And then another fun book about national parks by my friend Linda Muhammad, that are both kind of bigger topics than just a glacier specific or national park book. So those are 2 bonus books as well. But this is a great lineup. The top book is Natural Rivals, written by John Clayton. And it's about that rivalry between Mather and Muir. And really, and I think it's on exactly what you were talking about, Jerry. It's about that controversy, right? About the conundrum that is the Organic Act. And so it'll be interesting to hear from John and to read that book together. This Contested Land, marvelous book. I finished it in a weekend, about our why am I searching for
National monuments.
Thank you. National monuments, which of course can be made, shrunk, grown by presidential decree. And Mackenzie visited a number of those and writes elegantly about her experiences and the challenges in that conversation. The Jane Goodall of Wolves, Diane Boyd, is going to be with us. The newest offering by Sally Thompson, Disturbing the Sleeping Buffalo, with indigenous stories, very important book. Grizzly Confidential, a new book as well, and then a book about Glacier's Red, the Red Buses, by our friend Ray Duff. So join us for all of those. But I want to go back, Jerry, to this conversation we're having about, the Organic Act, which I actually gave a news interview just 2 days ago, because Glacier is doing another pilot to do visitation management, and people, this issue gets people kind of hot and bothered, right? And I try to step it back and say, look, the Organic Act is an almost impossible thing for park managers to do, which is keep it unchanged, unspoiled, and let people in, right? So that seems to be a narrative, and am I wrong in assuming that while Wright respected and wanted people to visit, that he fell a little bit onto that side of let's keep it the way it is? Is that a fair assessment?
That's a fair assessment. And actually, it was the other way for most of the Park Service administration until Wright and his team became more important within the service. Because up to that point, even though it sets up those 2 important goals within the Park Service, the emphasis had always been on what the term I used earlier, which actually came from Dick Sellers, who was a great historian and writer, facade management, which is what Mather and Albright practiced, which was, let's make sure that people can see a lot of animals. Let's have nice places to stay, and comfortable things to do. Let's put on bear shows. Let's put out salt licks along the roads so that the ungulates, come to the road, so you don't have to get out of your car. So they were all about visitation, increasing visitors, making the Park Service important, because it was competing with the Forest Service, and the BLM wasn't around yet. But there was these 2 sister agencies that were oftentimes butting heads, because the Forest Service was the one at the time that managed national monuments, and every time a national monument became a national park, the Forest Service lost that, and the National Park Service, gained that. So there was always that kind of going on. But that's the key. That's the nut of what Wright was working on, which was, the challenge of having animals and humans in the same park. Like, how do you deal with that? And you read Fauna 1, I mean, that's exactly what he's talking about. And so that's what they were trying to research and find out. The Park Service, I mean, obviously you have to develop facilities and roads to have people come into a park. But Wright's position was you only need so much of that. And then, he and his team and the other biologists, because the team eventually grew over time, they were all about trying to make people get out and about and go see wildlife as opposed to bringing wildlife to them, right? So they were really against road building, which if you think about the Wilderness Act, right, it's a roadless area, right? And the Wilderness Society was created in 1935, and they actually didn't like the Park Service, even though a lot of the people in the different organizations were friends and colleagues, but they didn't like what the Park Service was doing because they were all about, they were all about building roads, especially during the time when the CCC was really involved in parks and Roosevelt's time. And you build a road and you break up the wilderness. You build a road and all sorts of bad things happen relevant to wildlife and vegetation. These guys were also really good botanists. So it was a big issue back then in the Park Service, and Wright became more and more involved in the wilderness movement. He was very supportive of the Wilderness Society. He was very good friends with Bob Marshall, who also died early, like 38 of a heart attack, I believe. He had a congenital issue. And the Park Service adopted this kind of lazy, or they backed into describing wilderness as everything in a park that's not developed. I mean, think about that for a minute, which means, okay, well, we're going to develop as much as we want, and then everything else that's left over there, that's wilderness. And Wright was like, no, I mean, you have to have the basic infrastructure and the basic road in and out, and then everything else, should be left to its own, and you should be able to have people be able to travel into those areas, hike into those areas. And Bob Marshall, early on, he described wilderness as a place where you had to enter unmotorized and spend the night, at least one night, and keep going. I mean, it had to be really big. So
yeah, and we're so lucky in Montana, of course, to have the Bob Marshall Wilderness.
right.
And we work closely with the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, just affectionately known around here as the Bob.
The Bob, right.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and I think you write, and correct me if I'm wrong, that that you say that Wright talked about wilderness, or tried to get people to think about wilderness not as the absence of something, but as the presence of something special.
Right. He discussed when he later on in his career. I mean, again, right when he was in his late 20s, like late in his
right.
career. And he was getting very frustrated with the fact that wildlife and wilderness wasn't getting as much press and as much attention as it should. He shifted his thinking a little bit to make things a little more utilitarian. Like he was trying to get people out there involved in these things. And so he made the point that when you create a wilderness area within a park, it's not removing anything. It's actually making resources accessible to people, right? So he just tried to make it sound like they're not locking up anything. In fact, what we're doing is creating this incredible opportunity for you.
Yeah, no, I think that's that's something we try and talk about in Glacier. Glacier is interestingly not designated wilderness yet. So the Bob Marshall Wilderness is wilderness. Glacier is managed as wilderness, but isn't protected by law.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of discussion about that going forward. And before I hand this off to Amy, and again, we've already got some questions in the chat. Let's
good.
Feel free to ask some more questions in the chat. But I want to kind of transition a little bit to the topic of Glacier, because you before you knew that you were doing this, you wrote this book. It's really handy, and you talk a lot in there about Wright and his adjacencies in Glacier, and particularly about bison, which 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago, he's already seeing this issue about Blackfeet bison in Glacier Park. So talk to us a little bit about how you discovered Glacier and how that thread works for you?
Right. Well, I discovered his love of Glacier because over here, these are all his field notes, and all the field notes of Ben Thompson, his colleague, and all the field notes of Joseph Dixon, his other colleague, when they went on their big circuits, around the Western United States. And he also was a very avid fly fisherman, so he loved Glacier because he loved fishing. But they went on a lot of extensive hikes and horseback rides, and um, he knew through the literature. He was an extensive reader and had a very extensive library of like 400 books and 1,100 pamphlets and other kind of publications in the wildlife survey, in the wildlife office. So they knew bison had been there. Um, and but he really got interested one time when a trail crew way high up in Glacier uncovered a bison skull and gave it to Dixon and to Wright. And so then he really started thinking about what it would be like to have bison. And this is on the east side of the park, where it drops down into the reserve. And I've only been to Glacier once, so I'm not really speaking from personal experience. Um, Although we should probably correct that, right, Doug? Um, and So we started thinking about how great it would be to have bison reintroduced into the area, and so they could summer in the park and winter um, on the reservation and be co-managed. So this is like 90 years ago, and he was already talking about the possibility for co-management of a species, which is, back then was pretty radical. Today, it's more and more common, thank goodness, on for both cultural and natural resources in all sorts of parks, county parks, state parks, national parks. There's a lot of co-management going on with indigenous groups and agencies, which is fantastic. Here in Marin County, they do controlled burns together sometimes. Um, and So that was a really interesting idea, and it wasn't just because he liked the idea of bison being back for biological or ecological reasons. He actually wrote in Fauna that bison had been so important to the Blackfeet that to reintroduce them would be really important to the people culturally and socially, and that's why the co-management could really work. And he actually said what we could do is get X amount of bison. We could build a special corral on the reservation. We could keep them there for a year to acclimate them, so to speak, and have them oriented to that landscape, and then slowly experiment with seeing if they could move back and forth. Um, and it was not approved by the Park Service. I think it was a little too forward thinking. The Blackfeet actually weren't interested because I think they were still feeling very burned for obvious reasons, by the U.S. government for taking of their land, and they were afraid that it was just a ploy. Wright actually says they're concerned that it's just a ploy to take more of their land, to the east. It wasn't, although Albright, I think, was maybe, interested in the back of his mind. But also, this is the time when, right? So depression was taking place, and also there was a gigantic drought across the United States. I mean, Dust Bowl. Think about it. During the 30s, and so when he came up with that idea, and he had good relations with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I think it was called back then, or maybe a different name. Bob Marshall actually worked in that agency as their forester. And They said it wasn't feasible because of the drought, and the reservation was already totally overgrazed by sheep and cattle. So it was a great idea, very forward thinking, but didn't happen. And then eventually, obviously, bison have been reintroduced, which is fantastic for the Blackfeet.
It's been really they released some last year, and to see them running free with Chief Mountain in the background, I have to say it was a really emotional moment, and as you say, it also was a seminal moment for our superintendent and the National Park Service to say to the Blackfeet that you may manage this wildlife in a national park. and then actually let them do it. And I think that it's we're off to a good start. With
Right.
the project just begun, and the proof of the pudding is in the eating. But so with that kind of hook up to Glacier, Amy Lucky,
I have two other quick things though, Doug. Can I mention them?
yeah, of course.
So he also spent a lot of time in what he just called Belton, which you told me earlier was now called West Glacier.
Right.
He wrote two really important papers in Belton. One was the first concept of how to save the trumpeter swan, and it's really an incredible.
And Jerry, I have had many comments about just your breadth and depth of knowledge, and you're so fun to listen to. So I'm pretty sure we could be here all night. Yes,
tell my wife that.
I'll send it to you. We got it recorded now, I think.
Jeannie knows, she agrees.
Yeah. So our first sort of question comment is from Genevieve Biggs, and she wrote, "Hi all, I'm so glad to be here for the discussion, even though we can't be there in person." Yes, we're bummed about that as well. But Jerry, what was one of the biggest surprises or most moving discoveries, or both, you uncovered while researching this book?
Oh boy, thank you, Jenny.
Anytime.
Yeah. Like right before the 1906 earthquake and fire, the family didn't know. And so we just assumed, and the fire came within 2 blocks of their house, stopped at Van Ness from downtown. We just assumed maybe she died in the earthquake. And I got to know a researcher who is a Wright relative. I've never talked to her. I've never seen her. This is all, through messages and emails. And she does genealogy. Her name is Karen Botting. I know she lives in Arizona. And she was an amazing asset for me. I mean, I had a lot of people help me with research, but I could send her a question about someone and say, can you tell me about this person's family? Can you tell me about Joseph Grinnell's family, Joseph Dixon's family? I asked her about Mercedes Melendez and if she could find anything, and she found her death certificate. Wow. And she died of appendicitis, acute appendicitis, like within a couple of days. And so, very dramatic for the family and for those boys, because she had a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, and at that point, like a 10-year-old. And even the information of how they put her in a special metal lined, coffin and sent her back to El Salvador. And eventually I got to know the relatives down there, and they sent me pictures of where she is in the family, cemetery. So it wasn't closure for the family, because if you read the book, I'm through my wife, I'm related to the George Wright extended family. But it was fascinating and showed the power of really detailed research, and just added a lot of color to George Wright's life also. Well, at least it added an element to probably what made him into who he was, is someone that eventually in life he really wanted a family, especially after his auntie died. And he did. He got married and had two beautiful daughters.
Thanks, Jerry.
Anytime, Jen.
And thanks for the question, Genevieve. Jerry, Dave Baylor's also on tonight, and I wonder if he would unmute for us. Dave always has wonderful comments and questions, and tonight is no exception. Dave, would you mind?
No problem. Jerry, I'm related to one of those landscape architects and park planners that you mentioned in the paragraphs after George's death. Frank Matson was a park planner and landscape architect for NPS from the 1930s through his retirement in Yellowstone in 1962. He was in Yellowstone from 46 to 62. And he was a scenery manager. And I didn't know that much until a friend of my wife's from Yellowstone wrote to us, after the '88 fire in Yellowstone. And she had been driving down the west side. She said, I never knew what your dad did, Marge, but I looked up on the ridge south of the Madison Junction and I could see all the power lines and the telephone lines. And Frank, in Vista Management for the Park Service, managed to put all of those lines, those ugly lines, out of sight in the forest on the ridge. And they were revealed, of course, after the fires. But Frank planned a lot of cabins and road networks, both for Yellowstone and Glacier and Custer Battlefield. But he was one of those guilty parties you mentioned. I'm sure he met George at some point, but it was probably almost an irrelevancy. So on behalf of my in-law family, I apologize for that. So.
Hey, well, you know what? That actually sounds like almost like positive facade management, right?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
Like covering up, the ugly stuff.
He was always sensitive to trying to keep the vistas open to the natural world, as opposed to he fought the swimming pool in which was at one point installed in Old Faithful Lodge, and it's now gone in part because Frank lobbied against it when he was working there. So yeah. And thank you, Amy. Yeah.
Sure. Dave, did you also have a question about the borax ponds and if they were?
Oh, when I was in Canyonlands in the northern unit, there are lots of borax ponds there that are very visible from a few viewpoints. And since Albright was connected with that industry, I wondered whether he somehow managed to help have those borax ponds grandfathered, as it were.
That I don't know. Actually, Albright was potash.
Potash, okay.
That Mather was borax, and it was all out in like Mojave. It was in Southern California, out in the desert. And a lot of his business partners were from San Francisco, and he never got his hands dirty, but he would go visit. And so I don't know. I didn't know about those, but
maybe that's going to be the book I write. So okay, good.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I sort of think the two of you could talk forever. So thank you, Dave, for unmuting and asking your questions. I'm going to ask two more.
Book. Thank you, Jerry. Yeah.
Well,
sure. I'm going to ask two more, the next two questions, and then I'm going to announce the giveaway winners. And then I think Doug has a what do we call it? A fast round. I didn't get that right. Speed round. Thank you. Speed round. And then we'll get back to questions. So Eric and Tanya asked, commented and asked, there's a significant difference in the approach to conservation from Wright's era to our present times. Can you comment on the impact of taking so many specimens for museum pieces, especially the surfbird story?
Yeah, that is pretty brutal. But all in the name of science. All in the name of science back then. Yeah, Wright, we haven't even talked about predator control in the parks and on public lands, which is something that really fascinated me that I went really deep on. But it was terrible. But Wright was not anti-hunting. In fact, he collected a lot of specimens. He oftentimes, when he went on these prodigious 15, 20-mile hikes, he'd have his knapsack, his collecting shotgun, but it was, wasn't loaded to kill a grizzly bear. It was loaded to shoot birds with, fine shot so that it didn't disrupt them too much, so you can make skins out of them. But, back in the day, his mentors, Joseph Grinnell, who headed up the MVZ at Berkeley, and Joseph Dixon, they collected thousands of specimens, thousands. And the idea being that at the time, knowledge of specific species was pretty shallow. And so they needed specimens to be able to study and to also look at the difference between species geographically. And so I'm not defending what they did. It was just the way they did things back then. Wright went to Alaska with Dixon on a collecting trip, talking about the surfbird in 1926. And they collected boxes of mammals and birds and brought them back to not only MVZ, but then they also sent them off to the person that sponsored the trip. Nowadays we have technology and other ways to do it, which is fantastic. And so they weren't hunting for the sake of hunting. They were hunting in their minds to forward scientific knowledge, basically. Today we can put little transmitters on bees. They can put transmitters on just about anything. After the election, my wife and I have been watching a lot of nature shows instead of the news. And the photography is just like mind-blowing, right? As what they can do to track things. And it's like, I don't know how they do it. So, that's all I can really say about that. These specimens actually that they collected almost 100 years ago, they're still in museums. That surfbird is, still at Harvard, I believe, and you can ask to see it, and they'll pull it out and show it to you. Yeah.
Wow, cool. So here's an author to author question. This is Mackenzie's Long's question. So glad to be here and hear from Jerry about his lovely book. I'm curious about Jerry's writing and research process. You, Jerry, mentioned your nerdy research process. Can you describe it? And how were you able to get access to his personal documents? And how did you connect with the people you interviewed with?
Oh boy. Well, I married his granddaughter. That was the beginning. And when I met my mother-in-law, George Wright's one of his daughters, who's still with us at 91. She might be watching tonight. Hi, Pam. Pamela Melendez Wright Lloyd. When I met her, she showed me some of Wright's papers, and she showed me his original notebooks. And that's when I realized that he was a student of Grinnell, because I was at Berkeley at the time in grad school, and I had taken a zoology class where they taught me the Grinnellian system of taking field notebooks and field notes. In fact, it's up here somewhere. But mine's like 50 pages, and Wright's were hundreds of pages. But the type of binder, the format of the notes, exactly the same over all these years. And so I read those original field notes, handwritten field notes. And that was the beginning of really going down a lot of rabbit holes. Those are now at the Museum of Herpetozoology in an archival little library area. So I thought about this book off and on for a long time. I didn't actually do any sit down writing until 2019. And I just finished my last contract in the city with the Save the Redwoods League. And my wife and I decided that it was time just to do this thing, because I've been thinking about it for so long. And so before COVID hit, I was able to go into the National Archives, and it was just like opening up a treasure chest of information. The San Francisco Archives are actually south of San Francisco a little bit, but because the wildlife survey team was based out of Berkeley for the longest time, they would write everything in triplicate, and one stayed in the office, one went to the San Francisco office, and one went to DC. So they're all there, all the correspondence back and forth about all these different things that we're talking about, down to specific species. So it was an insane amount of information, and I was able to take photographs of all the correspondence I wanted. So I had all that also, which is sitting over here. So I did the National Archives, and then COVID hit, so they shut down. A lot of the university research libraries shut down. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't do anything remotely. So I had done a lot of research early on. And so luckily I had a lot to work with before COVID hit big time. So it was a great COVID project, right? I was in here for years. And I had also interviewed in 1987 Ben Thompson in Glenwood, New Mexico, which is kind of a long story, but Ben Thompson was George Wright's best friend. He ended up marrying George Wright's wife / his wife's sister after George Wright died. So he was actually part of the family. He was Uncle Ben and Annie Snook, Aunt Jane. And so we got to know him, and I went and interviewed him a couple times in New Mexico and met with him. And he just gave me a wealth of information because he was still everything he did with Wright and Dixon, at that point, 40 years before was fresh in his mind. And, I recorded it and transcribed it. And so I had all that information too. And then I got his field notes from his son, his original field notes from his son, copies. And then I had to do a lot of research to find Dixon's notes. A lot of them were in Sequoia National Park. And I went to those archives before COVID and made copies of everything because Dixon had spent a lot of time in Sequoia. So I accumulated all this stuff and then began to digest what to do with it. And that wall behind me there had a big pieces of butcher paper on it. And I just storyboarded chapters as I saw them. First, an overall storyboard of what I thought I needed to cover, and then individual chapters. And it was always changing. And I could flip them up and down and take them off and put them back up. And I also did a lot of riding in the pool. I'm a swimmer. And for 45 minutes, you're not thinking about much. And, I could concentrate on a specific problem or issue and then get out and write myself a note.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we're hard to believe we're already getting near the end of our hour. It wouldn't be a book club without a speed round. I did forewarn Jerry about this, and I'm gonna dispense with the first question, which will, I want to get my own disappointment out of the way quickly. So, Jerry, Stanford or Cal?
I can't answer that. Can't do it.
Okay.
You know what? I really don't care.
You really okay? That's good. I like that. All right. So this is my typical writer question: Stegner or Abbey?
Oh, that is so tough. Well, I have to say Stegner, Angular Repose, Beyond the 100th Meridian. Although it's interesting because some people think that his vision of the West is a little fictional. But anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But I have to say, I did spend a weekend with a guy in British Columbia once when I worked at the Mort Foundation, named Peacock, David Peacock, who was the character that Abbey used to fashion Hayduke.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And let me tell you something. He was the real deal. I mean, he was Hayduke. It was kind of a wild weekend, but we don't need to get into it. He's a bear expert, actually. And he was up there with a nonprofit, but that gave me new insight into the Monkey Wrench gang.
And I think he's a writer as well, too.
He's a very prolific writer.
Yeah.
Written a lot about grizzly bears.
He has, yep. Indeed. I've read some of his stuff. Okay, so you kind of in your writing, you give us a sense that you are a fan of Barry Lopez. So I'm going to ask, of Wolves and Men or Arctic Dreams?
Oh, Arctic Dreams, because that's kind of when I knew him best. He was like a distant mentor to me. I introduced myself to him, and we actually corresponded when people still did that. I still have his letters here, actually. And he invited me to a couple of book things in Berkeley. So I was always impressed with the fact that he was so nice. But he also had just come back from his first trip of maybe two he went from Antarctica, and then he went to the Arctic. And he wrote me this note that was just like, basically he said, my mind is blown. My image of the earth and the environment is like changed forever.
Wow. It's a fabulous book. If people haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Yeah. So George weighed in on this one, but there was some discussion and controversy about whether the park should be named Rio Grande or Big Bend. Where do you stand on that?
Oh, I gotta go with George. It should have been the Rio Grande, because his point was there's so many big bends in the Southwest that you got to go with, like, to really show the culture of the area and the cross-border culture and the history of the region. And he used in that quote, I don't know if you have it in front of you, but he used an amazing word that I have to look up every time I see it. It wasn't mellifluous. It was Rio Grande is much better than Big Bend for what reason?
I had it handy.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah, I don't have it handy.
That's all right.
I do have the book, but okay. So last and most importantly, Sammy Hagar or Jerry Garcia.
Well, I gotta say Sammy because I actually know Sammy, and my daughter's name is Sammy.
Well, there you go then. There you go.
Yeah, I am a neighbor to Sammy. He's not my neighbor. It's like he's been here long enough up on this mountain, although he does live in Southern California now, but he does drive under 55 occasionally up the hill.
Amazing, amazing. So Amy, we skipped the giveaway. You've got things to give away.
You know what? I did put the names in the chat.
Okay.
So Kelly Knox and Annabelle O'Connor are winners tonight, and you're each getting a Glacier Conservancy beanie, as well as a George Melendez Wright publication, Fauna #1. So we'll get those in the mail to you ASAP.
Awesome, super fun. Well, we are at the top of the hour. Jerry Emory, thank you very much for your time and for your friendship.
Thank you.
Fun to me. I look forward to seeing you soon. To all of our book clubbers, thanks for another great year. We will be doing all of our events will always be online on Zoom, and we're also going to be partnering with local bookstores. That's something that's worked for both the bookstores and for us to expand our reach. So look for more of that. Again, the books are behind me, and thank
Doug?
you. Yes, Amy.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt, but we didn't do book plates. For folks who want a book plate from Jerry, please email us at info@glacier.org, and he has graciously agreed to sign those. So I'm sorry, I couldn't leave without saying that. I know some people are real lovers of the book plates.
No, that's a great reminder. Thank you. And I actually have them here in my case. So that's, we'll get them to you, Jerry, to sign. So
it's a deal.
Again, thanks everybody. Have a wonderful holiday season. Thanks for all your support this year and every year. And we'll look forward to seeing you in January, if not before. Good night, everybody.